Thank you so much, Sarah and Gina and Abby and Danielle, who sponsored me coming here, and Raj and Bob and John. Incredible afternoon. Wasn't it just amazing hearing leaders like that? Incredible, 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 incredible. Every single word, every slide, I wanted to capture it and embody it and digest it and eat it and do whatever you need to do to keep it with you forever. So thank you so much. And I'm not a business person. I'll just start there. I wrote a book called The Soul of Money. And you would think, well, maybe that person, maybe they went to at least business school, or maybe they took economics, or maybe they balanced their checkbook. A person who writes a book called The Soul of Money, that would be logical for you to expect that. Or maybe this person knows about investing, or, doesn't have any credit card debt. But that's not the case. What I know about money doesn't have anything to do with that kind of training. My training in really our relationship with money, but also my training in love, comes from people that I used to call poor. And I used to call them poor because that's what we call people living in desperate circumstances, without financial resources, without jobs, without opportunities. We often call them poor. Often they're illiterate. They can't make ends meet. They live in some of the most desperate places on this planet. But through the great privilege that I had with the Hunger Project, an organization that I've been involved with since 1977, to really create the worldwide commitment to end world hunger. I had the privilege of working side by side for decades with people that I used to call, and maybe you used to call or have called, poor. And when you work with people living in those circumstances, and I'm sure some of you know this, you realize there's nothing poor about them. They are strong. They are resilient. They are capable and unbelievably competent. They're intelligent. They're filled with heart. And they exhibit more courage to live through one day than most of us are going to need in our lifetime. So they may be not able to read or write, but that's because no one gave them that opportunity. They may not know much about finance, but that's because they're not even involved in the money system. But who they are is not poor. Who they are is whole and complete people living in the crushing reality of resource poor circumstances. What's poor is their circumstances, not them. And we all know that harsh circumstances can be that which strengthens or that which debilitates. But who lives in those circumstances are whole and complete people. And when we label people particularly by their financial circumstances, we demean them and demean ourselves to put that kind of label on a whole and complete human being. The kind of people that I've had the incredible privilege to work with are people, many of them, living in conditions of war or post-war situations, refugee camps, places where desertification has entered into their life and they can't grow food any longer, they can't find water. People living in those circumstances have a lot to teach you and me about love. When you have no resources, where you go, if you have no outer resources, where you go is to your inner resources. The strongest, most powerful inner resources any of us have, and it is renewable, is love. It's the world's greatest power, the world's greatest renewable resource, the greatest access we have to our spiritual root, and it is the key to resolving all the problems we face. And these people that I used to call poor really know about that. I also learned a lot of lessons about money and life from people that I used to call rich. And if you think about that label, it does the same thing to people. These are whole and complete people living in the ebb and flow and often tyranny of excess resources sometimes that corrupt them a little bit, make them think they're more powerful than they maybe really are, have us relate to them in ways that are inconsistent with their humanity, try to get things from them. Do you know what I mean by that? When we label people rich, we demean them and we don't actually look at the human being over there. And for them, it's painful too, because they start thinking they are their stock price. They are their trust fund. They are their bank balance. And if something happens to that, then something happens to who they think they are. But they're whole and complete people living in the ebb and flow of sometimes the flood of financial resources. And I know we all want that for ourselves, but at the same time, there's some pain and suffering and challenges and risk there too. So these lessons about money didn't come from business school or econ class. They came from working with all my heart on ending world hunger. And I'm moved by that, because the power of taking a stand and living a committed life is the title for this little time I have with you. And somehow along the way, I was fortunate enough to be in the company of people who had taken what I call a stand and turned over their life to their commitment. In other words, they were defined by their commitment. And I became one of those people. And I was pretty young. I had a wonderful, very fortunate relationship with, the great Buckminster Fuller, who I didn't ever understand what Bucky was saying, but that didn't matter. I loved him. And there's a wonderful Emerson quote, who you are speaks so loudly, I can't hear the words you're saying. Have you ever heard that? That's the way I was with Bucky. I mean, this little bald man with thick glasses who, looked like a little fire plug on the stage, who talked about the intellectual integrity of the universe and all these wonderful things that I didn't understand. I couldn't not be around him. He was such a loving human being. And through Bucky and through the great work of the old EST training, in Aspen, there are probably a few STs around here, the old cult. If you were part of the old cult, raise your hand. And the Landmark Forum, which is the successor of the old cult. I've learned a lot about commitment. And I look back and see that I was lucky enough to fall into, with some great good blessing, the opportunity to live what I call a committed life. Now, a committed life I define as a life where what governs your decisions, what governs your action, what governs what you wear and get up in the morning and where you go and who you meet with is your highest commitment. And a commitment that's larger than your own lifetime. Almost like a commitment you can't possibly achieve. A commitment that you can get on the trajectory of in your lifetime and make a contribution to. That's a commitment that actually allows you or demands or invites you to turn your life over to it. And then that commitment governs your actions. And through that commitment, I have had a kind of life I never could have planned. I was raised as a Catholic. I thought Mother Teresa hung the moon. I loved her so much. I didn't like the Catholic Church a whole lot. Pardon me if you're into that, but I did. And I thought the Pope was a little weird. I like this Pope though. This is a good one. But Mother Teresa, she was just awesome. Obviously, we all know Mother Teresa was awesome. But then I ended up working with Mother Teresa, learning at her feet, being in communion with a living saint. I couldn't have planned that, but it came from the turning my life over to living what I call a committed life. I was at Nelson Mandela's inauguration. I was in South Africa the last day of apartheid. I sat there and saw him take the oath of office and turn the whole country over to Mandela. And I'll never forget these experiences. I could never have planned that. At the same time, I could never have planned to be in Ethiopia after the 1984, 84, and 85 famine, where 1 million people died in the Rift Valley, of starvation, and had the opportunity to sit in circle with 5 women who lost every single one of their children to starvation. Just think about that. If you're a mother or a father, one of the women had 11 children, and she lost every single one of them to starvation, including a baby suckling at her breast. If you can imagine such a horrible thing, starving to death because the mother, she had had no water for 7 days. And we sat around a dry well, and we had I had the opportunity and the privilege to be with them. There were actually 7 women. Sorry, I said 5, but there were actually 7 women. And what we did was what they wanted to do at the end of that horrendous famine. They were all childless mothers, which in Ethiopia at that time and still is not a badge of honor for a woman. And they wanted to tell the excruciating story of the death of each child. Little Mohammed walking towards a mirage, thinking there was water at 3.5 years old and collapsing on the way to the mirage. And when she finally reached him, he was dead. Talking about the life and death of each one of her 11 children. And after she would finish talking about Malika or Mohammed and the whole story of their death, we would cry. You couldn't help it. We, all of us, these women and I, would wail. African women, when they wail, Ethiopian women in particular, it's like comes from the guts of their bodies, comes from the heart of the earth. We would wail and cry and go into fetal position and hold each other. And then we'd calm down, take a break, and then we talk about the next child. So you can imagine this. This was 7 days and 7 nights. By the time we had honored the life and death of each one of the children of the 7 women, I don't know how many, but one woman had 5 kids, but everybody else had more than that, all the way up to 11 children. The women, we were spent, obviously you can imagine. We were exhausted. We were emotionally raw. We were bonded. We were close. And we knew that our lives needed to be about ending that so that no mother went through that again. And so these were women who had no education. And, it's hard to tell when people are in a starvation situation how old they are. They looked really old, but I think they were probably in their 30s and 40s. They didn't know how old they were because that's not important to them there. But so they made a commitment that they would use the rest of their childless life to make sure that they did everything they could to have no Ethiopian mother go through what they went through again. And I've lost track of all 7 women. There's a whole story there about how all this happened. But of those 7, we kept track of 4, and 4 of them went all the way through school. I had never learned to read or write or anything, all the way through school. And then of the 4 that I know about, one of them then went to law school and became an attorney. She's now an attorney. She runs the largest law firm in Ethiopia defending women's rights. And 3 of them got PhDs. Just imagine this now, PhDs. One is a scientist and runs a scientific institute, or did in Ethiopia. I'm a little bit out of touch with her now. And 2 of them became ministers in the government. And that experience took place, that incredible, miraculous experience that I had connecting with those women at the darkest place in their life, and seeing them take that and compost that pain, compost that suffering, compost that tragedy, and make themselves into great, remarkable, contributing women of service, is an example of people that I used to call poor. Can you see there's nothing poor about these people? It's a lack of opportunity. It's a lack of resources. What's poor is the environment, the circumstances in which they live. However, those circumstances often, and I would say more often than not, produce a kind of strength, a resilience, a spiritual depth, an inner set of resources that we would die for, that we're doing yoga, meditation, and using incense and everything we possibly can to get in touch with, when in fact, it's all there just waiting for our attention. So these experiences are the kind of experiences that I've had leading what I call a committed life. And I'll tell you another one, because I loved how the kind of theme of Raj's talk talked about women and the feminine and this gender balance. Because yes, I do, as he said, consider this the Sophia century. I kind of named it that. You can steal it and promote it. And if you think about this century, it's actually the first 100 years in the third millennium. Okay? It's another way to look at the times in which we're living. So Buckminster Fuller really taught me and all the people who had a chance to work with him about huge swaths of time, to really look at the continuum, where you are in the big continuum. And Raj talks about the 20th century. I say it's a 20th century was defined by war or the fear of war. It was a extremely fearful and violent, and we had 2 world wars, and we had a horrendous fear of war ever since the invention of nuclear power, and a very dominant century. How about the first century of the third millennium? So we're at the beginning, only 18 years into the third millennium. If we think about this as the Sophia century, the century when women will, in this 100-year cycle, take our rightful role in co-equal partnership with men, and the world will come back in balance. How about seeing this century? Yeah. How about seeing this century as the century of the fulfillment of this, he called it a parable. It is a parable, but also the prophecy of the indigenous peoples that have said that the first century of the third millennium would be the century when the bird of humanity that Raj talked about, I'm going to repeat that now, the bird of humanity that has a male wing and a female wing, and the male wing has been fully extended, indigenous people say, for centuries and centuries. And the female wing in everybody, in men and women, hasn't been fully expressed or fully extended. So the male wing has had to become overdeveloped, overmuscular, and in fact violent. And the bird of humanity has been flying in circles for centuries. And that in this century, the one that we're in 18 years into, the female wing in men and women will find its full expression, and the male wing can relax finally, and the bird of humanity will soar. You love that? I love this prophecy because it makes no one wrong. It's everybody's job to bring out the female, the feminine in all of us. It's everybody's job to relax the masculine or the yang where it's overdeveloped. And it's the opportunity really for humanity to soar. So I'm going to tell you another story. Let's see, which story? How much time do I have? Okay. I'm going to tell you another story. It's a Hunger Project story, and then I'll tell you a story about the Amazon if I have time. Let's see, I got to manage my time here. Is everybody with me still here? Okay. The other thing that's in the title of my talk, I always try to pay attention to that. Sometimes I forget what I'm supposed to be talking about. But the other part of it is the power of taking a stand. So I'm going to tell you a story about some women in Senegal. So Senegal is in West Africa, and Senegal is the place where the Sahel is moving about a quarter of a kilometer every year and sort of enveloping the whole country. And I've done a lot of work in sub-Saharan Africa during the days of the Hunger Project. And in Senegal, it's not an Islamic country, it's a Muslim country. In other words, there's many, many Muslims living in Senegal, and where I was working in for this particular story was in a place called the Tiez region, if you know Senegal at all, and with the Wolof people who live in the desert. And I was with a group of Hunger Project supporters, donors, and we were going to see the Wolof people. And it was in the middle of a very, very, very serious drought. And we were in, a couple Jeeps, and we went to the end of the road, and then no more road, just absolute, complete desert. Not one green thing, not a blade of grass, not a tree, not anything. And the drivers were Wolof people, and they somehow knew that after a certain, they stayed toward the direction the road had sent them, and then they jumped out of the car and they put their ear to the sand. And somehow that told them exactly where to go next, and it was drums. We didn't hear them, but they did. And they started driving our vehicles towards the drums. And eventually, I always cry. So if you cry too, please join me. I give you permission. We started to see little specks on the horizon, and the two drivers were driving towards these little specks. And the closer we got, we saw they were children running towards our vehicles, because in those situations, there'd be clouds behind the vehicles. Little, beautiful, gorgeous, delicious African kids. You just wanted to scoop them up and hug them, running, screaming with joy that we were on our way there. And then they led us to a place where there was a village of people who were near extinction, near death, sitting under what's called a baobab tree in Africa, where there's a baobab tree, there's shade. These are trees that live with almost no water. And they were all sitting under a tree, maybe 75 people. I can't really remember. It's in my book, so probably the right numbers are in there. And they were waiting for us, and the drums were beating, and we got out of our vehicles, and it was a Muslim community, and the mullahs were running the show, really like heavy duty mullah running the show kind of guys. And so we were there for several days, but what happened in this several day period, these people were starving to death. They had no water, had no water for actually years. People were dying. Old men primarily die first in those situations, and then small children. And they were burying 3, 4, 5 people a day. And they had wandered to this baobab tree, and they were kind of stuck there. And in the meetings that were taking place, because I'm a white woman from the United States, I was treated like a man. So the mullahs would allow me to sit in circle with them on the sand to talk about what to do. And the third day, before the meeting, the women came to me and said, "We know where the water is. We've dreamed it. We know that there's an underground lake right where we're sitting. But in our tradition, women are not allowed to dig, and the men don't believe it. They think we're foolhardy. They think we're dreamers, but we know it. We have the instinct, we can feel it." So in the next meeting, we're sitting in a circle, so you can picture me and then these guys, the mullahs and then the other guys. And the women were sitting primarily behind me, about 20, 30 women. They sort of filled in behind me. There was a point and we're sitting on the sand, okay? There was a point in the meeting where I could feel the woman who was kind of the leader of the women's initiative. I could feel her right behind me. So I kind of moved over like this. And there was a space, and she kind of moved up like this. And, in about 3 or 4 minutes, she was in the circle for the first time in the history of that village or culture. She was sitting in the circle. And then we moved over a little bit like this. And then another woman. And eventually, my presence, any woman's presence, gave the women permission to sit in the circle. And then there was a certain point at which we could actually have a conversation with them about what they saw. And through the generosity, I must say, of the men and the mullahs, and this situation of extreme desperation, the men were willing to let the women dig. They wouldn't dig with them. They wouldn't help them. They would let them dig. So we, being the Hunger Project, we went back, we got ropes and buckets, and we did all kinds of stuff to bring equipment to that village, and the women started to dig with babies on their backs and babies in their tummies, and, you know, they dug and they dug and they lowered each other down, and they dug and they dug and they dug, and they hit a huge underground aquifer, huge, an underground lake. There were about 75,000 people stretched in this desert that were without any water. This aquifer then, 2 years later, became the source of the productivity of about 16 villages, feeding about 75,000 people. They have grain storage. They have women's batik businesses. It was an absolute total transformation for this region. Yeah. So I have a zillion stories, so I'm going to tell you one more. So now I primarily work in the Amazon rainforest, as Sarah said, with the Pachamama Alliance. The word Pachamama means Mother Earth, the sky, the universe, and all time. There's a wonderful story about how we ended up there. It wasn't even on my radar, the Amazon rainforest. I was all about ending world hunger, but through a series of very miraculous and mystical events, which some of you have heard ad nauseum probably, but anyway, it's a wonderful story. My husband Bill and I, and a man named John Perkins, who Raj also quoted, John took us to the Ecuadorian Amazon to be with the Achuar people, Achuar, for what's technically or traditionally called first main contact with the modern world. And the Achuar are the only indigenous people in history, according to anthropologists, who initiated contact with the outside world before it came to them in ways they couldn't control. They were not in danger when they contacted us, but they saw in their dreams and visions that contact with the modern world was inevitable and that it would be very, very dangerous. And so they saw that the contact was coming in the year 2000. They started reaching out through dreams. This is how they communicated, and have phones then, through dreams, to bring people to them who could become their partners in understanding the modern world and ready them, prepare them to defend their life and their culture and their forest when the danger came in the year 2000 that the shamans and elders saw coming. And we ended up being those people. So our contact with the Achuar people was, you know, out of this world profound. I can't even describe it. And that too was a contact with only men. The Achuar are a warrior culture. They've been warring with the Shuar, the Shiwiar, the Zapra, the Kofan, all of these tribes for centuries. But they knew that the real danger was outside. But the warrior cultures are traditionally in the Amazon, this one particularly led by men. And so we had the encounter that changed our life. You can imagine how profound that was to sit with people in the rainforest who had had no contact. I was the first white woman they'd ever seen. It was just awesome. And it was the beginning of this alliance between the indigenous peoples of this part of the Amazon and conscious, committed people in the modern world like all of you. But this took place in 1994 and 5. And we never could speak with the women. And I had been working with the Hunger Project for 20, 25 years by then, and our whole strategy for ending world hunger, our central intervention for ending world hunger and poverty at the Hunger Project, and now most organizations say this as well, is uplifting the power of women and girls. That is the key intervention for ending hunger and poverty. It is the key intervention probably for everything, but clearly for ending hunger. And so I was like beside myself that we couldn't talk to the women. They didn't speak Spanish. They weren't educated. We couldn't talk to them. I didn't speak Achuar. And they were behind serving what's called chicha like this with their heads down, and then going back behind the men of the community. And some of them had 11, 12, 16 babies themselves. There were sometimes in some villages, a man would have 4, 5, 6, 7 wives and 50 kids. So the women were just, my heart went out to them. I saw that life was just not what I would wish on anybody. And yet we couldn't get any access to that. And you can't lay that on a culture, obviously. So it took years really of kind of holding my tongue and praying in my heart and loving them from afar. I couldn't even talk to them in the beginning. Some of you have been there with me, like I'm looking at Karen and Tina. And then in 2005, so we started in 1994, 95. So it's 10 years, 10 years. That was a long time for me. Some of the women came to us and came to my colleague, Margaret, and said, we want to meet with you about birthing practices. Our babies are dying in childbirth. We're dying in childbirth. We're leaving so many orphans. And my friend Margaret, who was a midwife, said she'd be happy to meet with them. So they had a conclave, and they shared, which is almost unbelievable, that for, I guess, centuries, women gave birth in the forest alone. They would go into labor, and they would take a machete, and they would go into the forest and hang themselves on a tree like this and try to give birth all by themselves. If you had a baby, you can imagine what that would be like. And they were also kind of conditioned to not scream, to not call out in pain. And if there was a footling or a breach, you can imagine the woman and the baby would die. And in some cases, it would be their 16th kid. So this was becoming such a huge realization for them that they weren't doing this, even though they thought this was sacred. This is what they believed, that they wanted to learn how to do safe birthing practices. So eventually, obviously, we responded with gusto, and we created what's called Ikiyama Nukuri in the Pachamama Alliance world, which is women and girls are the keepers of the integrity and the soul of the forest. And it's become not only about birthing practices, but about women's leadership in a warrior culture. And now the Achuar people have elected a woman vice president of, like, the vice chief of the tribe. Her name is Isabel. She has 6 kids. She's like, oof, she's so cool. And rather than being like this with her bowl of chicha, she walks around like this with the men, and she knows how to make things happen. And the Achuar have been lauded now as one of the most powerful and organized and effective indigenous groups in the entire Amazon, keeping oil and mining and everything out of their territory. So and what happened was one of the women took a stand. One woman, Narcisa Matienza. She took a stand. A stand is much more powerful than ambition. A stand is not a position. I make a distinction between taking a stand and taking a position. I say a position creates its opposition. I say pro-choice. You say pro-life. The stronger I'm pro-choice, the more entrenched you get with pro-life. I say left creates right, up creates down, here creates there. Positionality creates its opposition. That's the nature of positionality. It's not bad to take a position, but it has a dynamic that actually creates and brings forth, gives birth to its opposition. Are you following me here? And so a position is almost like geographic. So Kip, who's going to be on the next panel, can you raise your hand, Kip? So Kip is sitting over there. He has a particular position in the room. He sees me from partly the side, and I'm a certain size from where he's sitting. But let's say Bob, who's in the front row, sitting right here. Bob spoke. You remember Bob Chapman, the world's greatest CEO, #1 in my book. He has a different position. So he has a different point of view. So positions really are, another way of talking about them, are points of view. Just think about that. A point of view. A point of view is completely accurate for the person who has it. It's true for them. When we start arguing about our points of view instead of contributing them so that we can see the whole, that's when we get in a mess, like the United States Congress, liberal, conservative. These are points of view that aren't contributing to each other, but are rather opposing. So positionality can be very, very helpful. You need to know where you're sitting to get yourself out of the room. I'm all for positions. However, taking a stand is quite different. Just think about it. Archimedes said, give me a place to stand and I'll move the world. And you can, and you will. That's what Mahatma Gandhi did. He embraced all positions. When you take a stand, you elevate yourself above all the positions, and all of them contribute to what wants to move forward. When you take a stand, you join the domain of the Mahatma Gandhis, the Nelson Mandelas, the Mother Teresas. The people who really move the dial are people who take a stand. And inside of that, they take positions. Yes, no, this is good, this is bad. You know, Martin Luther King there's things he was against, but he lived from his stand rather than his position. Are you following me? So this, give me a place to stand and I'll move the world, and you can and you will, I say is what Narcissa Macienza did in the Amazon rainforest. I say that's what the women did in Ethiopia at the end of that famine. A stand is so powerful, and a stand taker derives their authority out of the stand they take, not out of a position, not out of being CEO or prime minister or head of anything. The real power of a stand, the authority, is out of the stand you take. You think about Gandhi, Mother Teresa. I mean, they had organizations, but the power came from their integrity, the stand they took. So I say the things that I've witnessed and the world that we're in is longing for stand takers who will allow positionality to contribute to go from point of view to vision. When you let go of your point of view, you're freed into vision. And vision is not only what you see, it's the capacity to see. So in my world and in yours, we're longing for people who can take a stand. And you don't need to have a position of authority to make a difference with your life. I'll just say finally, if you think about what really, 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 really matters to you, that's how you can find your stand. Not what you're against, but what you're for. I call myself a pro-activist. I love activists, but I call myself a pro-activist, an activist for, not rooted in what I'm against, although there's some things I really want to go away. But if I'm rooted in what I'm for, the vision of what I'm for, then I can look at what's between me and that vision with some compassion, with some skill to dismantle it, to address it, but not be against it. So I would say that the work of our time is to hospice the death of the old structures and systems that no longer serve us. Hospice their death, not kill them. They're dying. They're dying. They're dying their natural death. They are unsustainable. That means they're not going to last. And if we hospice them, just like those of you who are hospice workers in this room, like Tina Staley, who runs this amazing program, when you hospice a life or something that exists, it dies with dignity, it dies with appreciation and gratitude, and it dies sooner. While we midwife the birth of the structures and systems that no longer, that do serve us, hospice the death of the systems that don't serve us any longer, they're obsolete, that we realize aren't working anymore. They did their thing. They were helpful. while we midwife the birth of the new structures and systems that will serve us. That's what conscious capitalism absolutely is, in my view. It's a hospice midwife program. And hospicing and midwifing, just think about it. Those are acts of profound love. Hospicing and midwifing, acts of profound love from a stand for loving into existence the next chapter of the human family. So I am going to close this chapter of this part of the program, and then we're going to have a wonderful panel with all those awesome men that you heard this afternoon, and I get to moderate it, so I'll ask them all kinds of juicy questions. So don't go away, but thank you for your attention and your intention. And I love you.
Let's take